10 billion souls processed daily. Service ends only in death. This is the accounting of ordinary life in the Imperium of man, where every breath drawn serves the God Emperor's eternal war machine, and every exhale feeds the furnaces of worlds you will never see. Here lie the mechanics of survival for those born without the blessing of power armor or the curse of psychic gifts. The vast human engine that turns the gears of humanity's bloodiest millennium. This examination will trace the path from birth lottery to final rendering, how the Imperium sorts its children, feeds its workers, breaks its rebels, and converts its dead into something useful. You will see the taxonomy of suffering that keeps 10,000 worlds spinning in their orbits, the daily timetables that transform hope into productivity metrics, and the enforcement mechanisms that ensure compliance rates above 97%. By the end, you will understand why citizens pray for quick deaths and why the administratum files more termination orders than birth certificates. To understand why hope tastes like recycled air and why children learn to count in casualty rates before they learn their own names, start at the beginning. The Great Crusade ended 38 millennia ago, but the Imperium still drafts its children as if the next world burns tomorrow. What emerged from those ashes was not an empire, but a meat grinder with sacraments, a bureaucracy with bayonets, a prayer wheel that runs on human fuel. The Imperium's founding principle remains beautifully simple. Every person serves. Every person dies serving. The only variables are the timetable and the method. This principle carved itself into the bedrock of 10,000 worlds, not through conquest alone, but through the patient architecture of necessity. Food must be grown. Weapons must be forged. Ships must be crewed. The dead must be rendered into something useful. Someone must do these things, and that someone is everyone who lacks the authority to delegate the task to someone else. The first hive cities rose from practical considerations. Too many people, too little surface area, too much radiation outside the walls. The architects who designed them understood human psychology well enough to know that despair breeds compliance, and compliance breeds productivity. Hope, by contrast, breeds questions. Questions breed delay. The Imperium has no time for either. The population density mathematics tell their own story. A typical hive city houses between 100 million and 1 billion inhabitants in a space roughly equivalent to ancient Terra's Manhattan Island, but built vertically to heights that pierce the cloud layer and burrow into the bedrock below. The structural engineering required to support such concentrations of human life represents one of the Imperium's few genuine technological achievements. But the social engineering required to keep those populations functional represents something closer to art. Every hive follows the same basic design principles. The wealthy and powerful occupy the upper spires where the air is cleaner and the living space more generous. The workers occupy the middle levels where the factories and residential blocks maintain careful balance between productivity and habitability. The poor and the criminal occupy the lower levels where the waste processing plants and the recycling centers transform refuse into resources. Below the lower levels lie the underhive, where the Imperium's authority exists primarily as a legal fiction, and survival depends on skills that no educational programming teaches. The resource allocation systems that sustain these populations operate according to mathematical formulas that prioritize military production over civilian comfort, strategic reserves over individual nutrition, and systemic stability over personal freedom. Citizens receive exactly the quantities of food, water, air, living space, medical care, and recreational time required to maintain their productivity at optimal levels. Anything beyond these requirements represents inefficiency. Anything below these requirements represents waste. Names matter here, because each name decides a fate. A hive citizen carries papers that classify them into one of 12 primary labor designations, each as rigid as scripture and as permanent as death. The classification system begins at birth with genetic testing, psychological evaluation, and family background analysis that determines which educational track a child will follow and which career opportunities will be available to them upon reaching working age. The manufactorum workers, fabricants, spend their lives feeding raw materials into machines that dwarf city blocks. machines that consume metal ore and human attention spans with equal efficiency. Their tools are hammers the size of coffins, furnaces that roar louder than thunderstorms, and protective gear that functions right up until the moment it doesn't. Fabricants work in teams of 50 to 100 individuals, each responsible for a specific step in the production process, each dependent on every other member of their team for both productivity and survival. The most senior fabricants operate the primary forges, where raw metal gets transformed into the components required for Imperial military equipment. They work 12-hour shifts in temperatures that exceed 40 degrees Celsius, breathing air thick with metallic particulates and chemical vapors. Their life expectancy averages 32 years. Their replacement rate averages 12% annually. Their productivity scores determine their access to supplementary rations, medical care, and the protective equipment that might extend their careers by a few additional months. The intermediate fabricants handle the assembly processes where individual components get combined into finished products. They work with tools that require precise hand-eye coordination, sustained concentration, and the physical stamina to repeat the same motions thousands of times per shift. Repetitive stress injuries affect 96% of intermediate fabricants within their first year of service. Joint replacement surgery is available for workers who demonstrate exceptional productivity and loyalty. Pain management medication is available for workers who meet minimum productivity standards. Workers who fall below minimum standards receive reassignment to positions that require less manual dexterity. The junior fabricants perform the support tasks that keep the production lines operational, moving materials, maintaining equipment, cleaning work areas, and disposing of the waste products generated by industrial processes. They receive minimal training and minimal supervision, but they also receive the most direct exposure to the hazardous materials and dangerous machinery that make industrial production possible. The injury rate among junior fabricants is approximately 40% per year. The fatality rate is approximately 8% per year. Survivors develop the experience and physical resilience required to advance to intermediate positions. The agri-workers, cultivants, tend to the hydroponic forests and protein vats that feed the upper spires. They breathe recycled air thick with growth hormones and industrial fertilizers, their hands permanently stained green from chemicals that accelerate plant growth and, coincidentally, accelerate cellular degradation in human tissue. Most cultivants develop respiratory issues by age 30. Most don't live to see 40. The fertility rates in the agricultural sectors remain classified, but midwives there stock more grief counseling materials than birthing supplies. The hydroponic specialists maintain the vast growing chambers where engineered crops produce the grains, vegetables, and fruits that supplement the standard protein paste rations. They work in environments with carefully controlled temperature, humidity, and atmospheric composition. But those same environmental controls expose them to concentrations of agricultural chemicals that exceed safe exposure limits by factors of 10 or more. Hydroponic specialists develop characteristic symptoms within 6 months of beginning their careers: persistent coughing, skin discoloration, and a peculiar form of chemical sensitivity that makes them unable to tolerate the standard air recycling systems used in residential areas. The protein cultivation specialists oversee the vast tanks where engineered organisms convert organic waste into edible protein. They work with biological systems that require constant monitoring and adjustment, systems that can produce nutritious food efficiently, but can also produce toxic compounds if the cultivation parameters drift outside acceptable ranges. Protein specialists develop expertise in biochemistry and microbiology that rivals that of trained scientists, but they apply that expertise in industrial environments where contamination incidents can kill hundreds of people and where equipment failures can destroy months of food production. The soil management specialists maintain the growing medium that supports both hydroponic and traditional agricultural production. They process the organic waste generated by millions of citizens, combining it with chemical additives and engineered organisms to create the nutrient-rich substrates that modern agriculture requires. Soil specialists work directly with the sewage, garbage, and biological waste that urban populations produce, But they also work with the corpses of citizens who have died from accidents, disease, or old age. The Imperium wastes nothing that can be recycled into useful resources. The transport workers, logistors, move freight through the endless tunnel networks that connect hive levels. They navigate by memorizing 10,000 corridor numbers, load cargo until their spines compress like accordions, and sleep in shifts aboard cargo haulers that never fully stop moving. A logistor's life expectancy is measured not in years, but in routes completed. Veterans, those who survive more than 1,000 freight runs, develop a peculiar form of spatial dementia where they can navigate any tunnel system in the galaxy, but can no longer remember the faces of their own families. The heavy cargo specialists operate the massive freight elevators and conveyor systems that move materials between hive levels. They work with loads that measure in the hundreds of tons, equipment that operates under pressures and stresses that can cause catastrophic failures without warning. Heavy cargo specialists develop the physical strength and mechanical intuition required to handle industrial equipment safely. But they also develop the fatalistic attitude that comes from working with systems where human error results in deaths measured by the dozen rather than by the individual. The route specialists navigate the transportation networks that connect different areas within and between hive cities. They memorize maps that cover thousands of miles of corridors, tunnels, and roadways, maintaining mental databases of traffic patterns, route conditions, and security checkpoints that change daily. Route specialists provide the logistical intelligence that keeps the transportation system functional, but they also accumulate the kind of detailed knowledge about hive infrastructure that makes them security risks. Their average career length is limited not by physical demands, but by the policy of rotating them to different assignments before they learn too much about the systems they serve. The maintenance specialists repair and maintain the vehicles, equipment, and infrastructure that transportation depends on. They work in repair bays located in the deepest levels of the hive cities, areas where the noise from machinery drowns out conversation, and the air circulation systems cannot keep pace with the chemical vapors generated by industrial solvents and lubricants. Maintenance specialists develop respiratory problems, hearing loss, and neurological symptoms caused by chronic exposure to toxic chemicals. They also develop the mechanical expertise required to keep transportation systems operational despite inadequate funding, insufficient replacement parts, and maintenance schedules that prioritize productivity over safety. The maintenance workers, Mechanicus auxiliaries, crawl through the ventilation systems, power conduits, and waste processing networks that keep the hive functional. They carry toolkits that weigh more than they do and work in spaces so confined that panic attacks become a professional hazard. The auxiliaries develop a reputation for emotional detachment not because they lack empathy, but because caring too deeply about the things they've seen in the deep maintenance shafts leads to catatonia. Their unofficial motto, "Fix it first, have feelings later." The power system specialists maintain the generators, transformers, and distribution networks that provide electricity to millions of citizens. They work with electrical systems that operate at voltages high enough to kill instantly and currents high enough to vaporize human tissue. Power specialists receive extensive training in electrical safety and emergency response procedures, but they also work with equipment that has been in continuous operation for centuries, and that fails in ways that no training manual anticipates. The fatality rate among power specialists is approximately 15% per year, with most deaths occurring during emergency repair operations that cannot be delayed long enough to implement proper safety protocols. The water system specialists oversee the pumping stations, filtration plants, and distribution networks that provide clean water to civilian populations. They work with systems that process millions of gallons per day, removing pollutants and pathogens from water sources that include industrial runoff, sewage discharge, and the runoff from the corpse processing plants that recycle human remains. Water specialists develop expertise in chemistry and biology that enables them to identify and neutralize contamination sources. But they also develop chronic health problems from exposure to the very contaminants they work to remove. The air circulation specialists maintain the ventilation systems that provide breathable air throughout the hive cities. They work in the vast mechanical spaces where enormous fans move air through filtration systems that remove dust, chemicals, and biological contaminants from the recycled atmosphere that most citizens breathe. Air circulation specialists spend their careers crawling through ductwork, repairing filtration equipment, and monitoring air quality in environments where equipment failures can suffocate thousands of people within hours. The waste processing specialists handle the garbage, sewage, and industrial waste that urban populations generate. They operate the recycling plants that transform refuse into raw materials, the treatment facilities that process biological waste into fertilizer, and the incineration plants that destroy materials too contaminated to recycle safely. Waste specialists work with materials that include toxic chemicals, infectious biological agents, and radioactive compounds. Their work environments require full protective equipment, but that equipment malfunctions frequently enough that chronic exposure to hazardous materials becomes an occupational certainty. The structural maintenance specialists repair the buildings, tunnels, and infrastructure that house millions of people and support industrial production. They work at heights that require specialized climbing equipment, in confined spaces that require rescue teams on standby, and with materials that include asbestos, lead compounds, and exotic alloys whose health effects remain unknown. Structural specialists develop the acrobatic skills and industrial knowledge required to perform repairs under dangerous conditions, but they also develop the injury patterns that come from careers spent working in environments where safety equipment represents a luxury that few can afford. The clerical workers, administratum scribes, process the paperwork that transforms human lives into manageable data points. Each scribe maintains an average of 4,000 individual case files, updating birth certificates, death certificates, work assignments, ration allocations, transportation permits, and criminal records with handwriting so precise it resembles mechanical printing. A single error in transcription can redirect food shipments, reassign families to different labor sectors, or accidentally conscript someone into the Imperial Guard. The data entry specialists maintain the vast archives where the administratum stores information about every Imperial citizen. They work with filing systems that cover thousands of square miles of floor space and contain billions of individual records. Data entry specialists develop the mathematical and organizational skills required to locate specific information within these archives. But they also develop the repetitive stress injuries that come from careers spent performing the same precise motions millions of times. Hand surgery is available for specialists who demonstrate exceptional accuracy and productivity. Disability reassignment is available for specialists whose injuries prevent them from maintaining required performance standards. The calculation specialists perform the mathematical operations required to maintain resource allocation systems, production quotas, and logistics networks. They work with numbers that describe the lives and deaths of millions of people, but they process those numbers as abstract mathematical problems rather than as representations of human experience. Calculation specialists develop mental mathematics skills that enable them to perform complex operations without mechanical aids. But they also develop the emotional detachment required to calculate casualty projections, starvation schedules, and execution quotas as routine administrative tasks. The document authentication specialists verify the accuracy and legitimacy of official paperwork. They examine thousands of documents per day, checking signatures, seals, formatting, and content for signs of forgery, alteration, or unauthorized modification. Authentication specialists develop the observational skills required to detect subtle inconsistencies in handwriting, paper quality, and bureaucratic language. But they also develop the paranoid mindset that comes from careers spent assuming that most people are attempting to deceive the system. The correspondence specialists handle the communication networks that connect different Imperial institutions. They encode, transmit, and decode messages that carry information about military operations, resource shipments, and administrative decisions affecting billions of people. Correspondence specialists work with communication systems that require absolute security and perfect accuracy. systems where errors in transmission can cause supply shortages, military defeats, and civilian casualties. The stress-related mental health problems among correspondence specialists exceed those found in any other civilian occupation. The archive specialists maintain the historical records that document imperial policy, legal precedent, and administrative procedures. They work in vast underground storage facilities where millions of documents slowly deteriorate despite climate control systems that consume enormous amounts of energy and resources. Archive specialists develop expertise in document preservation, historical research, and information retrieval, but they also develop the respiratory problems that come from careers spent breathing air filled with paper dust, preservation chemicals, and the microscopic organisms that feed on organic materials. The security personnel, enforcers, maintain order through the careful application of violence and the more careful threat of additional violence. They carry shock batons, crowd control gas, and the authority to declare any gathering of more than 3 people a potential riot. Enforcers receive training in 14 different methods of non-lethal crowd dispersal and 2 methods of lethal crowd dispersal. The non-lethal methods work approximately 60% of the time. The lethal methods work 100% of the time. Job satisfaction among enforcers correlates inversely with years of service. The patrol specialists maintain visible security presence in residential and commercial areas. They walk predetermined routes on schedules designed to maximize deterrent effect while minimizing personnel costs. Patrol specialists develop the observational skills required to detect early signs of civil unrest, criminal activity, and unauthorized gatherings. But they also develop the physical conditioning required to respond to violent situations without backup support. The injury rate among patrol specialists is approximately 30% per year, with most injuries resulting from confrontations with citizens who resist arrest or challenge authority. The investigation specialists handle criminal cases that require more than routine enforcement actions. They interview witnesses, examine evidence, and prepare cases for trial by arbitrator personnel. Investigation specialists develop expertise in forensic science, criminal psychology, and interrogation techniques, but they also develop the ethical flexibility required to obtain confessions through methods that prioritize efficiency over accuracy. The conviction rate for cases handled by investigation specialists exceeds 90%, but the appeal rate for those convictions approaches 0 due to the processing delays that make legal appeals impractical for most citizens. The riot control specialists respond to civil disturbances, labor strikes, and other situations involving large groups of potentially hostile citizens. They deploy tear gas, water cannons, and sonic weapons designed to disperse crowds without causing permanent injury. But they also deploy lethal force when non-lethal methods prove insufficient. Riot control specialists work in teams trained to operate as coordinated units, but they also work in situations where crowd dynamics can change rapidly and where individual decisions can determine whether confrontations end with arrests or with massacres. The detention specialists operate the prison facilities where convicted criminals serve their sentences. They supervise inmates who have been convicted of crimes ranging from minor productivity violations to serious offenses against imperial authority. Detention specialists develop expertise in prisoner management, facility security, and rehabilitation programming, but they also develop the authoritarian mindset required to maintain control over populations of people who have been stripped of their civil rights and personal autonomy. The staff turnover rate in detention facilities exceeds 40% per year, with most departures resulting from stress-related mental health problems. The execution specialists carry out death sentences imposed by imperial courts. They operate the equipment used for public executions, maintain the facilities where condemned prisoners spend their final days, and provide the technical expertise required to ensure that executions proceed according to established protocols. Execution specialists receive extensive training in human anatomy, mechanical systems, and crowd management, but they also receive psychological counseling designed to help them cope with the emotional stress of killing people as a professional responsibility. The service workers, menials, perform the tasks too numerous, too degrading, or too dangerous for automation. They clean the blood off the factory floors, serve food in the communal eating areas, maintain the communal latrines, and dispose of the bodies that accumulate in the lower hive levels. Menials receive no formal training and no formal recognition. Their job classification exists primarily to ensure that someone, somewhere, accepts responsibility for the work that no one else wants to claim. The sanitation specialists clean the public spaces, work areas, and residential facilities that millions of people use daily. They work with cleaning chemicals that can cause chemical burns, respiratory problems, and neurological damage. Sanitation specialists develop the stamina and chemical tolerance required to perform physically demanding work in hazardous environments. But they also develop the social invisibility that allows them to move through public spaces without attracting attention from citizens who prefer not to acknowledge their existence. The food service specialists prepare and distribute the meals that sustain civilian populations. They work in industrial kitchens that process thousands of meals per shift, combining processed ingredients according to recipes designed to provide adequate nutrition at minimum cost. Food service specialists develop expertise in large-scale cooking techniques and food safety procedures, but they also develop the cynical attitude that comes from preparing meals that they themselves cannot afford to eat. The corpse disposal specialists handle the human remains that result from industrial accidents, disease outbreaks, and natural deaths. They collect bodies, transport them to processing facilities, and oversee the recycling operations that convert human remains into useful materials. Corpse disposal specialists work with biological materials that pose infectious disease risks and psychological materials that pose mental health risks. Their job requires them to maintain detailed records of every body they process, but those records get filed in the same archives as production statistics and equipment maintenance reports. The crowd control specialists manage the queues, lines, and gatherings that form when large numbers of people need to access limited resources or services. They direct foot traffic, distribute information, and maintain order during food distribution, medical examinations, and administrative processing. Crowd control specialists develop expertise in group psychology and conflict resolution, but they also develop the interpersonal skills required to manage frustrated, desperate, and occasionally violent groups of people who have been forced to wait for essential services. On the ground, it reduces to a timetable and a heartbeat. The morning shift begins at 0500 Imperial Standard, signaled by sirens that can be heard through 6 inches of reinforced steel. Citizens wake, dress in uniforms provided by their assigned labor sector, and consume their daily nutritional allocation: a protein bar that tastes like sweetened cardboard, and a vitamin supplement that tastes like nothing at all. Breakfast ends at 0530. Transit to workstations begins at 0535. Delays are recorded and reported to supervisory personnel. The residential compartments where citizens sleep measure 8 feet by 12 feet for single occupants, 12 feet by 16 feet for couples, and 16 feet by 20 feet for families with children. Each compartment includes sleeping platforms that fold down from the walls, a small storage area for personal possessions, and access to shared bathroom facilities that serve approximately 50 people per unit. Privacy consists of thin fabric curtains that provide visual barriers but no sound insulation. Personal space consists of the area immediately around each person's sleeping platform. The bathroom facilities include communal showers with water temperature controlled by central systems, communal toilets with minimal privacy partitions, and communal washing stations for cleaning clothes and personal items. Citizens receive 30 minutes of hot water access per week and unlimited cold water access for drinking and basic hygiene. Soap, toothpaste, and other hygiene supplies are distributed monthly in quantities calculated to meet basic sanitation requirements. Citizens who require additional supplies can obtain them through the black market economy that operates in most residential areas. The clothing provided to citizens consists of work uniforms appropriate to their labor classification, undergarments designed for durability rather than comfort, and seasonal outer garments for protection against weather conditions. Clothing gets replaced when it becomes too damaged to function properly, typically every 18 to 24 months for work uniforms and every 3 to 5 years for seasonal clothing. Citizens who wish to improve their appearance or comfort can do so by trading labor, resources, or favors for better clothing through informal networks. The transit systems that transport workers between residential areas and work sites operate on schedules designed to minimize transportation time while maximizing vehicle capacity. Citizens travel in cargo vehicles that have been modified with bench seating and basic life support systems. Transportation time averages 45 minutes each direction, during which citizens are expected to review educational materials or participate in mandatory discussion groups led by volunteer citizen educators. The work shift runs for 11 hours with a 30-minute meal break and 2 10-minute rest periods. The meal consists of processed protein paste, carbohydrate paste, and reconstituted water. The protein paste provides essential amino acids derived from recycled organic materials. The carbohydrate paste provides energy from processed grain products and synthetic starches. The reconstituted water has been filtered to remove contaminants and fortified with vitamins and minerals. The entire meal contains approximately 800 calories and meets minimum nutritional requirements for sustaining physical labor. The rest periods are spent standing in designated rest areas because sitting might encourage workers to fall asleep. Rest areas include motivational displays featuring Imperial propaganda, productivity statistics, and safety reminders. Citizens use rest periods to perform stretching exercises designed to prevent repetitive stress injuries, to review work procedures and safety protocols, and to participate in brief recreational activities such as group singing of imperial hymns. Productivity standards require each worker to maintain output levels at 93% of theoretical maximum efficiency. This standard assumes that workers will perform their assigned tasks with minimal errors, minimal delays, and minimal need for supervisory intervention. Workers who exceed these standards receive commendations and may qualify for improved rations or housing assignments. Workers who fall below these standards receive remedial training. Workers who fall below these standards twice receive enhanced remedial training. Workers who fall below these standards 3 times are reassigned to more suitable positions. The productivity measurement systems track individual performance through electronic monitoring, supervisor observations, and peer evaluations. Each worker wears identification tags that record their location, movement patterns, and interaction with work equipment. Supervisors conduct hourly observations of work performance, noting errors, delays, and violations of work procedures. Peer evaluations provide additional data about worker cooperation, attitude, and reliability. The enhanced remedial training programs provide intensive instruction in work procedures, safety protocols, and attitude adjustment techniques designed to improve performance. Workers who participate in enhanced remedial training receive additional educational programming during their off-duty hours, closer supervision during work shifts, and psychological counseling aimed at identifying and correcting the behavioral problems that contribute to poor performance. Enhanced remedial training programs have a success rate of approximately 30%. The evening shift ends at 1600 Imperial Standard. Workers return to their residential compartments, which measure 8 feet by 12 feet and house between 3 and 7 people depending on family size and housing availability. Evening activities include equipment maintenance, personal hygiene, and mandatory educational programming broadcast through the communal vid screens. The educational programming covers topics such as recognizing heretical thoughts before they occur, maximizing nutritional value from standard rations, and appropriate responses to authority figures. The equipment maintenance period requires workers to inspect, clean, and repair the tools and protective equipment they use during work shifts. Workers receive basic training in equipment maintenance and are held responsible for the condition of their assigned equipment. Equipment that fails due to inadequate maintenance results in productivity penalties for the workers responsible. Equipment that fails due to normal wear and tear gets replaced according to schedules that prioritize essential safety equipment over items that merely improve comfort or convenience. The personal hygiene period provides citizens with time to wash, groom, and perform basic medical self-care. Citizens receive training in hygiene procedures designed to prevent the spread of infectious diseases, maintain basic health, and present an appearance appropriate to their social status. Citizens who develop health problems that interfere with their work performance receive medical attention aimed at restoring their productivity rather than improving their quality of life. The mandatory educational programming includes news broadcasts featuring imperial victories and enemy defeats, instructional programs covering work skills and safety procedures, and cultural programming designed to reinforce imperial values and social cohesion. Citizens are expected to pay attention to educational programming and may be tested on its content during routine supervisory interactions. Citizens who demonstrate inadequate knowledge of educational content receive additional programming during their sleep periods. Lights out occurs at 2200 Imperial Standard. Sleep is scheduled for 7 hours. The cycle repeats the following morning. Citizens track their productivity through point systems that determine their access to supplementary rations, improved housing assignments, and medical care that extends beyond basic wound treatment. High-performing workers receive bonuses such as additional protein paste, thicker blankets, or the privilege of working overtime shifts. The point accumulation system awards credits for productivity achievements, perfect attendance, participation in voluntary activities, and cooperation with authority figures. Citizens lose points for productivity failures, tardiness, disciplinary violations, and attitude problems. The point totals determine eligibility for advancement opportunities, access to luxury items, and priority for medical care during resource shortages. Citizens who accumulate sufficient points over a lifetime of service may qualify for retirement to the senior living sectors, where they can spend their remaining years performing light maintenance duties and sharing their expertise with younger workers. Then there is the moment everyone remembers and no one explains. I was 17 years old, 3 weeks into my assignment as a manufactorum fabricant, when the production line stopped. Not slowed, not paused for maintenance. Stopped. In 11 hours of daily operation, the line stops only for catastrophic mechanical failure or imperial inspection. Neither had been scheduled. The silence felt wrong in a way that made my teeth ache. 50,000 tons of machinery doesn't simply shut off without leaving an echo, but the silence was complete and immediate, as if someone had pulled the audio feed from reality itself. The other workers stood frozen at their stations, tools still raised, waiting for instructions that didn't come. We had been trained for equipment failures, supply shortages, and emergency evacuations, but no one had trained us for this. I counted heartbeats in the darkness. The emergency lighting should have activated within 30 seconds of a power failure, but the darkness continued. The ventilation system should have switched to backup power within 60 seconds, but the air remained still. The communication system should have provided status updates within 90 seconds, but the speakers remained silent. After 5 minutes of perfect darkness and perfect silence, I began to understand that this was not an equipment failure. The shift supervisor walked onto the production floor wearing his dress uniform instead of his standard work clothes. His expression carried the particular kind of blankness that authority figures display when they are about to announce something terrible in the most routine possible manner. He activated a portable public address system and spoke 4 sentences that would reshape my understanding of what it meant to be human in the Imperium of man. Production quotas for this sector have been exceeded by 12% over the past month. Efficiency improvements have eliminated the need for current staffing levels. 7,000 positions will be terminated effective immediately. Report to your residential compartments and await further instructions. The math was simple. 7,000 people had worked themselves out of their jobs by doing those jobs too well. The reward for exceeding expectations was to become redundant. I understood, in that moment of perfect silence, that productivity was not actually the goal. Control was the goal. Productivity was merely the method. The workers began filing toward the exits in orderly lines, because even in the face of elimination, we followed procedure. No one spoke, no one ran, No one protested. We had been trained too well for that. The exit procedure took 47 minutes to complete, during which time the shift supervisor continued updating his logbook, recording productivity statistics and personnel actions with the same careful handwriting he used for routine daily reports. As I walked toward the exit, I caught a glimpse of the shift supervisor updating his logbook, recording the successful completion of a workforce optimization operation. His handwriting was neat and careful, the kind of penmanship that comes from years of practice documenting other people's disasters. The page he was writing on was identical to hundreds of other pages in the same logbook, all containing similar entries about productivity improvements and personnel adjustments. The corridor outside the production floor contained other workers from other departments, all walking in the same direction with the same expressions of careful neutrality. The transportation systems had been adjusted to accommodate the sudden movement of thousands of people, with additional vehicles and modified schedules that ensured efficient processing of displaced personnel. The entire operation had been planned in advance with the same attention to detail that characterized every other aspect of Imperial administration. I spent the next 18 hours in my residential compartment, waiting for further instructions that would tell me whether I was among the 7,000 or among the survivors. The instructions arrived in the form of a single sheet of paper slipped under my door. Report to Administratum Processing Center 7 Alpha for career reassignment evaluation. I had survived the cut by becoming a problem for a different department to solve. The reassignment evaluation process took 6 hours and included aptitude testing, psychological evaluation, and review of my productivity records and disciplinary history. The evaluation officer asked me 17 questions about my work experience, educational background, and career preferences. I answered each question honestly and completely, because lying to evaluation officers results in automatic assignment to the most hazardous available positions. At the end of the evaluation, the officer handed me new identification papers and work assignment documents. My new position was Transport Specialist, Grade 3, assigned to freight route maintenance in the lower hive tunnels. The work was more dangerous than manufactorum assembly, the hours were longer, and the life expectancy was shorter. But it was still employment. It was still service to the Imperium. It was still better than the alternatives that awaited citizens who had no useful skills to contribute to the Imperial war machine. After the smoke clears, the rules return. The Imperium operates according to a legal framework known as the Codex Administratum, a document that runs to approximately 47 million pages and covers every conceivable aspect of human behavior, from the proper method for requesting additional rations to the appropriate forms of address when speaking to servitors. The Codex gets updated daily through a process that involves 17 different bureaucratic departments, each of which must review and approve any proposed changes before they can be implemented. The revision process for Codex updates begins with the identification of situations that are not adequately covered by existing regulations. Citizens, supervisors, and administrators submit formal requests for clarification or modification of existing rules through standardized forms that must be completed in triplicate and filed with the appropriate departments. Each request gets reviewed by subject matter experts who determine whether the proposed changes are necessary, practical, and consistent with existing Imperial policy. The review process includes legal analysis to ensure that proposed changes do not conflict with other sections of the Codex. Cost-benefit analysis to determine whether the changes would improve administrative efficiency, and security analysis to determine whether the changes might create opportunities for abuse or subversion. The review process typically takes between 3 and 8 months to complete, depending on the complexity of the proposed changes and the availability of qualified review personnel. The approval process requires signatures from representatives of all departments that would be affected by the proposed changes. Department representatives must verify that their personnel have the training, equipment, and authority required to implement the changes effectively. They must also verify that their departments have the budget and staffing resources required to support any additional administrative requirements created by the changes. The implementation process includes the distribution of updated Codex sections to all relevant personnel, training programs to ensure that personnel understand the new requirements, and monitoring systems to ensure that the new requirements are being followed correctly. Implementation typically takes between 6 and 12 months to complete, depending on the scope of the changes and the number of personnel who must be trained in the new procedures. The average time required to approve a minor revision to the Codex is 4 months. The average time required to implement that revision is 8 months. By the time any change takes effect, the circumstances that necessitated the change have usually evolved beyond recognition, requiring additional revisions that must go through the same lengthy process. The legal system that enforces the Codex operates on the principle of assumed guilt, with the possibility of proving innocence through proper documentation. Citizens who are accused of violating imperial law have the right to present evidence in their defense, provided they can produce the appropriate forms, file those forms with the correct departments, and wait for the processing period to complete. The standard processing period for legal appeals is 6 months. Citizens who are unable to work during this period do not receive rations and are therefore unlikely to survive long enough to hear the results of their appeals. The evidence requirements for legal defense include documentation proving that the accused citizen had the proper authorization to perform the actions in question, witness testimony from imperial personnel who can verify the citizen's version of events, and expert analysis demonstrating that the citizen's actions were consistent with established procedures. Citizens who cannot provide adequate documentation face automatic conviction on the original charges. The witness testimony requirements include sworn statements from individuals who have security clearance appropriate to the case, personal knowledge of the events in question, and no conflicts of interest that might affect their credibility. Citizens who cannot produce qualified witnesses face automatic conviction on the original charges. The expert analysis requirements include technical evaluation by specialists who have appropriate credentials, access to the equipment or materials involved in the case, and authorization from their supervisors to participate in legal proceedings. Citizens who cannot obtain expert analysis face automatic conviction on the original charges. Punishments for legal violations follow a strict hierarchy based on the severity of the offense and the repeat offense rate of the individual citizen. Minor infractions, such as being late for work shifts or failing to maintain proper equipment, result in deductions from the citizen's productivity points. Additional work assignments, or temporary restriction of privileges such as recreation time or supplementary rations. Moderate infractions such as questioning work assignments or expressing dissatisfaction with living conditions result in assignment to enhanced educational programming, increased monitoring by supervisory personnel, and reassignment to work duties that provide fewer opportunities for social interaction with other citizens. Major infractions, such as attempting to leave assigned residential areas without proper authorization or spreading information that contradicts official imperial doctrine, result in reassignment to labor sectors with higher casualty rates, imprisonment in detention facilities, or assignment to penal colonies where survival depends on the ability to perform useful work under extreme conditions. Citizens who commit crimes against the Imperium itself, treason, heresy, sedition, or conspiracy, face immediate trial by arbitrator personnel trained in battlefield justice. These trials typically last between 30 and 90 minutes and have a conviction rate of 98%. The remaining 2% of cases result in summary execution for wasting the arbitrator's time. Sentences for crimes against the Imperium include servitor conversion, where the convicted citizen undergoes surgical modification that removes their human consciousness and replaces it with mechanical programming designed to perform useful tasks. Penal colony assignment, where the convicted citizen is transported to hostile worlds and expected to perform useful labor until they die from environmental hazards or workplace accidents. Or public execution broadcast on educational programming to demonstrate the consequences of poor citizenship. The quota system that governs daily life operates according to mathematical formulas that account for resource availability, population density, and strategic military requirements. Each hive city must contribute specific quantities of manufactured goods, agricultural products, and human personnel to the greater imperial war effort. These quotas are calculated by the administratum using data that is, on average, 18 months out of date due to the time required to collect, process, and transmit information across interstellar distances. The resource allocation formulas include calculations for raw material consumption, energy requirements, transportation costs, and labor productivity rates. The formulas assume optimal working conditions, perfect equipment reliability, and maximum cooperation from civilian populations. The formulas do not account for equipment failures, supply shortages, natural disasters, enemy attacks, or the gradual degradation of infrastructure and personnel that occurs over time. The population density calculations determine how many citizens can be supported in each residential area based on available living space, food production capacity, and waste processing infrastructure. The calculations assume that citizens will consume exactly the quantities of resources allocated to them and will generate exactly the quantities of waste predicted by mathematical models. The calculations do not account for individual variations in resource consumption, changes in population demographics, or the accumulation of waste products that cannot be recycled efficiently. The strategic military calculations determine how many citizens must be conscripted into military service, how many must be assigned to military production duties, and how many can remain in civilian positions that support the war effort indirectly. The calculations assume that military casualties will remain within predicted ranges, that equipment losses will be replaced according to established schedules, and that enemy forces will behave according to intelligence estimates. The calculations do not account for unexpected military developments, changes in enemy capabilities, or the political factors that influence strategic decision-making. When actual production levels exceed quota requirements, the excess resources are shipped to other imperial holdings that have failed to meet their own quotas. The transportation and distribution of excess resources requires additional labor, fuel, and administrative oversight that reduces the net benefit of exceeding quotas. But the quota system does not account for these additional costs. When actual production levels fall short of quota requirements, the shortfall must be compensated through increased efficiency measures, extended work shifts, or population reallocation. Population reallocation involves moving workers from residential sectors with surplus labor to residential sectors with labor shortages. The reallocation process includes productivity assessments to determine which workers are most suitable for transfer, transportation arrangements to move workers and their families to new locations, and housing assignments to accommodate the relocated populations. The transportation and housing logistics required for population reallocation typically cost more resources than the productivity gains they generate, but the quota system does not account for logistical efficiency, only for numerical compliance with established targets. Citizens who exceed their individual productivity quotas receive commendations that are recorded in their permanent files and may result in improved housing assignments, additional rations, or priority access to medical care. Citizens who consistently exceed their quotas may qualify for advancement opportunities that provide better working conditions, higher social status, and increased authority over other citizens. Citizens who fail to meet their individual productivity quotas receive remedial training, closer supervision, and assignment to tasks that are designed to improve their performance through repetitive practice and behavioral conditioning. A few things still work, though none are kind. Citizens who wish to improve their circumstances have access to several advancement opportunities within the imperial system, provided they demonstrate exceptional competence, unwavering loyalty, and the ability to complete tasks that others cannot or will not perform. The most reliable path to advancement involves volunteering for hazardous duty assignments that require specialized skills and offer correspondingly specialized risks. Technical specialization represents the most accessible form of advancement for citizens with the intellectual capacity and emotional stability to master complex equipment operation. Specialized technicians receive additional training in mathematics, physics, chemistry, and engineering principles that enable them to understand and maintain the sophisticated machinery that keeps imperial civilization functioning. The training programs last between 6 months and 3 years, depending on the complexity of the equipment and the prior education of the trainees. Technical specialists receive improved rations that include fresh fruits and vegetables, supplementary protein, and vitamin supplements that are not available to general workers. They receive residential compartments that measure up to 20 feet by 15 feet, with private bathroom facilities and individual climate control systems. They receive medical care that includes preventive treatment, specialized procedures, and rehabilitation services that extend beyond basic wound treatment. Technical specialists also receive responsibility for maintaining equipment whose failure could kill thousands of people, and they work in environments where a single mistake can result in explosions, toxic gas releases, radiation exposure, or catastrophic system failures. The training required to avoid such mistakes is intensive, continuous, and psychologically demanding. Technical specialists must demonstrate perfect understanding of complex procedures, perfect attention to detail, and perfect emotional control under conditions of extreme stress. The mortality rate among technical specialists exceeds that of general workers due to the hazardous nature of their work environments and the catastrophic consequences of equipment failures. Technical specialists who survive their first 5 years of service develop the expertise and psychological resilience required to work safely with dangerous systems, but they also develop chronic health problems caused by exposure to radiation, toxic chemicals, and high-stress working conditions. Military service offers the most dramatic advancement opportunities for citizens who pass the physical and psychological evaluations required for Imperial Guard enrollment. The evaluation process includes tests of physical fitness, mental capacity, emotional stability, and loyalty to Imperial authority. Citizens who pass the evaluations receive military training in weapons operation, tactical procedures, battlefield medicine, and survival skills. Imperial Guard service provides regular meals that include fresh meat, vegetables, and dairy products. Professional training in valuable skills such as equipment maintenance, communications, and leadership. Access to advanced medical care that includes surgery, trauma treatment, and rehabilitation. And the opportunity to see other worlds and participate in the great crusade that defends humanity against its enemies. Imperial Guard service also provides a 94% casualty rate over the course of a standard 10-year enlistment period. Most casualties occur during the first 2 years of service, when inexperienced soldiers make mistakes that expose them to enemy fire, environmental hazards, or equipment accidents. Soldiers who survive their initial deployments develop the combat skills and tactical knowledge required to serve effectively, but they also develop the psychological problems that result from prolonged exposure to violence and death. Citizens who survive their military service receive veterans' benefits that include priority job placement, supplementary rations, and residential compartments in the upper hive levels. Veterans also receive psychological counseling to address the mental health issues that affect approximately 87% of military survivors, including anxiety, depression, sleep disorders, and social adjustment problems that make it difficult to return to civilian life. Clerical advancement within the administratum hierarchy offers the safest path to improved living conditions, but requires citizens to demonstrate exceptional skills in mathematics, record-keeping, and bureaucratic procedure. The selection process includes aptitude tests, background investigations, and loyalty evaluations that screen candidates for intelligence, reliability, and commitment to Imperial values. Advanced clerical positions include supervisory responsibilities over other clerical workers, private office space with improved lighting and climate control, and access to information networks that connect different Imperial holdings. Senior clerks receive salaries instead of rations. Housing assignments in residential areas reserved for administrative personnel, and social status that provides access to cultural events and educational opportunities not available to general workers. Senior clerks also bear responsibility for decisions that affect the lives of millions of people, including resource allocation, personnel assignments, and policy implementation. They work under constant surveillance by security personnel trained to detect signs of corruption, incompetence, or disloyalty. The pressure of making decisions that determine whether people live or die, combined with the knowledge that any mistakes will be punished severely, creates levels of psychological stress that few people can tolerate over extended periods. The stress-related mortality rate among senior administratum personnel is 12% per year, with most deaths resulting from cardiovascular problems, mental health crises, and suicide. Senior clerks who survive more than 5 years in their positions develop coping mechanisms that include emotional detachment, rigid adherence to established procedures, and social isolation that protects them from the psychological burden of their responsibilities. Citizens who demonstrate particular talents for leadership, problem-solving, or specialized technical knowledge may qualify for transfer to other imperial institutions such as the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Ecclesiarchy, or the Inquisition. These transfers represent the highest possible advancement for civilians, offering access to advanced training, superior living conditions, and meaningful authority over others. Transfer to the Adeptus Mechanicus requires citizens to undergo surgical modification that replaces organic body parts with mechanical alternatives, enhancing their ability to interface with machinery, but fundamentally altering their human nature. Transfer candidates receive training in advanced engineering, computer science, and biotechnology, but they also undergo psychological conditioning that reduces their emotional responses and increases their logical reasoning capabilities. Transfer to the Ecclesiarchy requires citizens to undergo spiritual indoctrination that reshapes their understanding of reality according to imperial religious doctrine. Transfer candidates receive training in theology, psychology, and public speaking, but they also undergo behavioral modification that eliminates doubts, questions, and independent thinking that might interfere with their religious duties. Transfer to the Inquisition requires citizens to undergo psychological modification that enhances their ability to detect heresy, corruption, and disloyalty, while eliminating the compassion and moral flexibility that might prevent them from taking necessary action against enemies of the Imperium. Transfer candidates receive training in investigation techniques, interrogation methods, and combat skills, but they also undergo emotional conditioning that makes them capable of torturing and killing other human beings without psychological damage. These transfers typically occur during childhood, when candidates can be selected based on aptitude tests and genetic analysis that predict their suitability for specialized training. The transfer process requires candidates to spend decades in educational programs that have completion rates below 20%. Candidates who fail to complete their training are typically assigned to support roles within their chosen institution, where they serve as assistants and technicians for more successful candidates. For citizens who lack the qualifications, physical capability, or psychological stability required for advancement opportunities, survival depends on developing unofficial strategies for navigating the imperial system. The most basic survival strategy involves maintaining productivity levels at exactly the minimum required standard, avoiding both the scrutiny that comes with poor performance and the additional responsibilities that come with exceptional performance. Experienced workers learn to monitor their productivity metrics carefully, adjusting their work pace and output quality to meet requirements without exceeding them significantly. They develop techniques for conserving energy during work shifts, managing stress during off-duty hours, and maintaining their health despite inadequate nutrition and medical care. They form informal social networks that share information about shift changes, equipment problems, and supervisory personnel behavior patterns. The social networks that develop within civilian populations provide mutual support, information sharing, and informal resource distribution that supplements the official systems provided by imperial administration. Citizens who participate in these networks can receive warnings about impending policy changes, access to black market goods and services, and assistance during personal emergencies or family crises. The information sharing within these networks includes details about work assignments, housing availability, medical care access, and advancement opportunities. Citizens share strategies for improving productivity scores, avoiding disciplinary actions, and navigating bureaucratic procedures. They also share information about which supervisors are reasonable and which are arbitrary, which work assignments are relatively safe and which are extremely hazardous, and which administrative offices process requests efficiently and which create unnecessary delays. The resource sharing within these networks includes food, clothing, medicine, and equipment that citizens obtain through official channels but do not need immediately. Citizens who receive surplus rations share them with citizens whose rations are insufficient. Citizens who receive new clothing share their old clothing with citizens whose clothing is damaged. Citizens who receive medical supplies share them with citizens who cannot access medical care through official channels. The most successful survival strategies involve cultivating relationships with citizens who have access to resources, information, or decision-making authority. Workers who provide small services to supervisory personnel, equipment maintenance, information about other workers, or assistance with paperwork may receive preferential treatment in work assignments, housing allocations, or disciplinary proceedings. Citizens who demonstrate reliability and discretion in these unofficial arrangements can gradually build networks of mutual obligation that provide protection against the arbitrary dangers of imperial bureaucracy. These networks operate according to unspoken rules that emphasize reciprocity, loyalty, and secrecy. Citizens who violate these rules by failing to reciprocate favors, betraying confidences, or reporting unofficial activities to authorities face social isolation that makes survival much more difficult. The black market economy that exists within most civilian populations provides access to goods and services that are not available through official channels or that are available only to citizens with higher social status. The black market includes food items that provide variety and improved nutrition, clothing that offers better comfort and appearance, medicine that treats health problems not covered by official medical care, and luxury items such as books, music, and recreational materials. The black market operates through barter systems that allow citizens to exchange labor, information, and resources without using official currency or creating records that might attract administrative attention. Citizens who participate in black market activities develop skills in negotiation, risk assessment, and security procedures that help them avoid detection by enforcement personnel. The environmental hazards that threaten civilian populations include air pollution from industrial processes, water contamination from waste disposal systems, radiation exposure from power generation and manufacturing equipment, and toxic chemical exposure from cleaning supplies and maintenance materials. These hazards cause chronic health problems, including respiratory diseases, cancer, neurological disorders, and reproductive problems that reduce life expectancy and quality of life. Citizens who work in high-risk environments develop survival strategies that include sharing information about hazard locations, maintaining personal protective equipment through unofficial channels, and providing mutual assistance during emergencies. They learn to recognize the early symptoms of occupational diseases and to seek treatment before their conditions become severe enough to interfere with work performance. The safety protocols that exist for workplace hazards are typically implemented only when the cost of workplace injuries exceeds the cost of prevention. As a result, citizens must often choose between following official safety procedures that reduce productivity and maintaining productivity levels that expose them to unnecessary risks. Citizens who prioritize safety may receive disciplinary action for failing to meet productivity standards. Citizens who prioritize productivity may suffer injuries or illnesses that end their careers. Step back far enough and the pattern refuses to blink. The Imperium of Man operates as a machine designed to convert human lives into military resources with maximum efficiency and minimum waste. Every aspect of civilian existence serves this primary function, from the allocation of food and housing to the organization of work schedules and the structure of legal systems. Citizens exist to produce the materials, equipment, and personnel required to maintain humanity's war against the alien, the heretic, and the demon. Their individual needs, desires, and aspirations are relevant only insofar as they contribute to or detract from this central purpose. The system works because it has been designed by people who understand human psychology well enough to create conditions where compliance becomes the path of least resistance, and resistance becomes indistinguishable from suicide. Citizens who accept their circumstances and focus on performing their assigned tasks can expect to live lives that are difficult but predictable. Citizens who question their circumstances or attempt to change them can expect to encounter bureaucratic obstacles, legal penalties, and social isolation that make survival increasingly difficult. Citizens who actively resist the system can expect to be eliminated through processes that are efficient, thorough, and completely documented. The propaganda that supports this system emphasizes the nobility of sacrifice, the importance of duty, and the existential threat posed by humanity's enemies. Citizens are taught from childhood that their suffering serves a greater purpose, that their individual lives matter less than the survival of the species, and that questioning these principles represents a form of selfishness that borders on treason. The educational programming that reinforces these lessons is carefully designed to provide just enough information to maintain work productivity while avoiding the critical thinking skills that might lead to uncomfortable questions about the necessity or effectiveness of the current system. Citizens learn to read and write well enough to follow work instructions and complete administrative paperwork, but they do not learn the analytical skills that would enable them to evaluate the information they receive or to develop alternative solutions to the problems they face. The religious framework that justifies this system presents the God Emperor as a divine figure whose sacrifice on the Golden Throne makes possible humanity's continued existence in a hostile universe. Citizens are taught that their own sacrifices represent a form of worship that honors the Emperor's example and contributes to his ongoing struggle against the forces of chaos. The imperial cult provides rituals, ceremonies, and social structures that give meaning to suffering and transform individual deaths into collective victories. The psychological comfort provided by these beliefs helps citizens endure conditions that would otherwise lead to despair and social collapse. But it also prevents them from questioning whether those conditions are actually necessary or whether alternative approaches might achieve the same results with less human cost. The economic system that sustains this arrangement operates according to principles that prioritize resource allocation toward military production and strategic infrastructure, while providing civilian populations with the minimum resources required to maintain productivity. Market mechanisms exist primarily to facilitate the exchange of surplus resources between different sectors of the imperial economy, not to provide consumer choices or improve living standards. Citizens have limited control over their economic circumstances, but they can influence their resource allocation through productivity improvements, advancement opportunities, and participation in informal bartering networks. The economic incentives built into the system reward compliance and productivity, while punishing questioning and innovation, ensuring that the system remains stable even when it operates inefficiently. The greatest tragedy of civilian life in the Imperium is not the individual suffering endured by billions of human beings, but the systematic waste of human potential that this suffering represents. Entire populations of intelligent, creative, capable people spend their lives performing repetitive tasks that could be automated, living in conditions that could be improved, and dying from causes that could be prevented. The resources and labor required to maintain the surveillance, punishment, and control systems that keep citizens compliant could instead be used to address the problems that make such systems seem necessary. But changing the system would require acknowledging that it was designed by people who chose control over prosperity, order over justice, and stability over hope. The Imperium of Man stands because someone decided that 10 billion lives are worth less than one functioning bureaucracy.